Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians second roundtable of our 2020 conference. This is Using Quantitative Data to Disrupt Historical Narratives and Archives. I'm Dan Hallett. I will be your moderator for this roundtable conversation. You can find me on Twitter and Reddit as user dhallett1692. We're going to go through and have our panelists introduce each other. They are all from my cohort at George Mason University, so it's really great to see them here and hear their work. So we will start and we will go in reverse alphabetical order. So let's start with Janine.
Thanks, Dan. My name is Janine Hubai. I am a second-year PhD student at George Mason University. I have my master's degree in history from UMass Boston, and I'm excited to be here today. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Gale, also a second year at George Mason. I have my master's in history from University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and I'm very excited to be doing a virtual conference. I think that's a really cool thing we're doing.
Hi, I'm Georgia Farrell. I'm a second year PhD student at George Mason, and I received my Master's of Arts in History at George Mason.
Hi, I'm Laura Brannon. I'm also a second year PhD history student at George Mason, and I have my master's in women's gender and sexuality studies from Georgia State University, and happy to be here tonight as well.
Great, and we'd also like our guests to introduce themselves. So let's start with Mike.
Hello, I'm Mike Dash. I have a PhD from King's College London, and my master's came from the University of Cambridge.
I'm Sarah Gilbert. I am a postdoc at the University of Maryland. I have a PhD in Library and Information Studies from the University of British Columbia.
It's good to have all of you here. I'm looking forward to the conversation we'll have. What we're going to do is our panelists will have short presentations, and then we will move on to discussion. If you have questions for them that you want to remember, you can put them in the chat. Otherwise, we can go around. You can either type them or ask them once they finish. So let's start off with Janine and continue in that order.
Thanks, Dan. I'm presenting Revelation and Erasure, IPUMS USA databases in New Mexico's population from 1850 to 1920. Some years back, I conducted research on the 1850 census of Santa Fe, New Mexico for a genealogy class. It was the first US government census of the region since the US annexed the New Mexico territory following the Mexican-American War. I did not expect the diversity of the city in 1850. It included Native New Mexicans, American Indians, African Americans, and Anglo-Americans from several different states, as well as Europeans, many of them serving in the military. But there was a group of the population that caught my eye, American Indians with Spanish names. Many were children and lived within households of both New Mexicans and Americans. One such child, Manuel McKnight, was 12 years old in 1850 and was born in Navajo, or as I figured out was Navajo with Spanish pronunciation. From old books about the Santa Fe Trail and newspaper ads, I determined he lived with a merchant who traveled the Santa Fe Trail for many years, finally bringing his family to Santa Fe by 1850. Also residing with his family was Kitty McKnight, an adult female African-American slave. By 1860, the McKnights were back in Missouri, Kitty was freed, and Manuel lived with a group of Teamsters in Santa Fe. Who was Manuel McKnight? Manuel McKnight, along with the other American Indians with Spanish names I referenced earlier, are Genazaros, American Indian people who were captured in raids or war, sold into slavery, baptized Catholic, and given Spanish names. While many of the men were sent to silver mines, women and children were bought or gifted to New Mexican households. This is a practice rooted in Spanish occupation. They were a select group of people, deeply oppressed, stripped of their native culture, family, and language. I'm not sure when between 1850 and 1860 the McKnights went back to Missouri, whether they offered to bring Manuel back with them or left him to fend for himself. In the spring of 2020, I took the opportunity to study New Mexico between 1850 and 1920 using census data in a digital humanities class based in the computer programming language R. R is a statistical analysis program that allows you to take complex data and have the program compute for you. I make it sound easier than it is, but what you end up with are new ways to look at data and the ability to present your data in colorful maps and graphs. On the advice of my professor, Dr. Lincoln Mullen, I decided to use a database called IPUMS USA. Created by the University of Minnesota, IPUMS contains all US Census data from 1790 to 2010. You can pick and choose which categories or variables, as we say in digital humanities, you want to research, such as year, region, age, birthplace, or occupation. I chose to focus mainly on race, ethnicity, and birthplace. There is a big learning curve when using IPUMS data, as the race, ethnicity, and birthplace categories have a multitude of different data options to use, as you can see from all these blue plus signs on this image. Once I figured out which categories were best for my project, I was able to analyze the data in R to look at how the demographics changed over time. Much of my research confirmed what many scholars have claimed before. As white Americans moved to the area, they became a greater percentage of the New Mexican population. After 1900, as the New Mexico Territory was seeking statehood, politicians encouraged white Americans to settle in New Mexico to make New Mexico appear more American, or in reality, more white. Up until 1900, New Mexico was predominantly Hispanic and American Indian. The Hispanic population spoke Spanish and were Catholic. American Indian populations spoke their native language and practiced their indigenous religions, Catholicism, or a hybrid, all of which were not considered traits of the ideal American. Using both race and ethnicity and birthplace, you can see the increased percentage of American settlers and the decreased percentage of Hispanic populations on both charts. So on the chart on the left-hand side, you can see in 1850, 95% of the population was born in New Mexico. And all the way to 1900, we see a decrease with a sharp decrease in 1910 as those Americans were moving into New Mexican territory. So that only a little bit over 50% of the population was born in New Mexico. And then if you look at the Hispanic population, which is kind of this pea green color, you can see in 1850, they constitute almost all of the population, except for this small percentage here. And then by 1900, 1910, 1920, you get that they are less than 25% of the population. And this also creates a question about American Indian populations. The US Census has not counted all people consistently and evenly. As you can see on this image, American Indians represented in turquoise have an uneven population pattern. Sometimes American Indians were counted, sometimes they were not, sometimes some were and some were not, and sometimes they were on their own census rolls. And this is where we encounter the limitations of using big data in historically oppressed people. IPUMS is big data, which means it takes a lot of different census data and creates a large database of census information. While my initial census research of 1850 Santa Fe was done by hand, time-consuming, and very limited in scope, R allowed me to use a larger data set and expand my research. I laugh at this picture now, but my research done by hand included 4,500 people, and I had 13 different variables per person, which comes to about 5,500 variables to analyze. Using IPUMS, I was able to analyze 8 different census years, increase my geographic area to include all of New Mexico, and include many different categories, some not even on the original census. That includes 1.2 million individuals and more variables, with millions of variables to analyze with more complexity and in much less time. IPUMS is great for looking at the bigger picture of the population. It is a useful tool and a tool that continually adjusts to be sensitive to people of color and oppressed people. However, I could not find Manuel McKnight in the IPUMS USA data. Since the individual entries are anonymous, meaning they are not tied to a name, you have to look for other variables to identify people, such as an age or birthplace or occupation. He simply did not show up. He was erased. Had I started with IPUMS USA data, I may have never encountered Manuel McKnight or the other Genizzaros in Santa Fe in 1850. Therefore, as historians, it is important to continue to dig deeper into primary source material, research original census data, and familiarize ourselves with the people in it. When we do this, we find Genizzaros were always counted on Spanish colonial census reports, appear in court cases, and currently are reclaiming their history and identity. We as historians have a moral obligation not to contribute to their erasure and help in their reclamation. Thank you.
So my project is entitled Running from Cultural Genocide, Carlisle Indian Boarding School Runaways and Hidden Resistance, 1890 to 1900. So let's first start with a story. On December 14, 1891, a headline for an article in the Pittsburgh Dispatch exclaimed in all capital letters, "Indians in chains, they leap from moving train." According to the article, 4 students from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania had run away, sending one of their teachers, W.P. Campbell, on a 2-day journey to recapture and bring them back. 6 weeks prior to running away, a young Shawnee man known as Reynolds had voluntarily come to the school claiming to seek an education. After being at the school for just a few weeks, he and 3 other male students from the Shawnee, Blackfoot, and Grass Ventura tribes ran away from the school. Making it all the way from Pennsylvania to an unnamed town in Missouri, the students were eventually recaptured. On the way back to the school, however, 2 of the students escaped, sending Campbell after them once again. When all 4 boys were back in Campbell's custody, he placed them in chains and transported them back on a train back to the school. The shackles, however, were not properly secured and were worn out. When the train reached Jefferson, the boys threw off their cuffs and in a bold move of escape, jumped from the moving train. After spending about a day hidden in the countryside in Topeka, Kansas, all but one of the boys were recaptured and taken back to the school in a farmer's straw sack. When reporters asked if boarding schools were truly an effective means of educating Indians, given the ease with which 4 boys were able to escape and create such a public spectacle, Campbell downplayed their entire flight, blaming the entire episode on the influence of one bad Indian. Despite Campbell's insistence to the latter, running away did not occur in isolation, nor could it be blamed on the influence of a single individual. By the early 20th century, Indian boarding schools became one of the key instruments of assimilation policy and settler colonialism. Established during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Indian boarding schools were federally funded and taught students to speak English, embrace Euro-American dress and traditions, and disregard their native language and culture. These students, however, were not passive victims of forced assimilation. Between 1890 and 1900, approximately 121 students were dismissed from Carlisle for running away. These students did not just come from one tribe or nation. Although the Chippewa and the Seneca ran away at a rate consistently higher than their peers, students from 43 distinct tribes and nations attempted to flee the school during this brief 10-year period. For these students, running away can be seen as a subtle yet powerful form of resistance against settler colonialism and cultural genocide. Computational history is sometimes dismissed as dehumanizing historical subjects by reducing living people to mere statistics. By using R to examine computational data in relation to these runaways, however, we can gain valuable insight into what factors influenced a student's decision to run away. I constructed my own data set by taking information from the school's Register of Discharged Pupils and combined it with student records. I then used R to produce maps and line graphs to visualize how things such as school's proximity to home reservation, time of year, and rate of disease and sickness at the school all became factors in the decision to run away. The closer a student's home reservation was to the school, the more likely a student was to try to run away. Students whose home reservations were in New York ran away the most frequently, with 48 runaways over the span of 10 years. Students were also less inclined to run away during winter months when weather could prevent safe travel, and were also less likely to run away during periods of increased illness or death at the school. In the archive, these students are just names on a roster that treats running away as a behavior problem rather than an active agency. With computational history, however, we could see how these students were dynamic historical actors who had to weigh multiple factors in their efforts to resist forced assimilation.
All right, hello again, everyone. So my project is called Mapping Itinerancy, George Fox's Journal, and it is a digital project aiming to demonstrate the importance of itinerancy, the act of constantly traveling from place to place, to the growth and spread of Quakerism rather than just to their religious expression. So first, we need some context. Who were the Quakers? The Religious Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers, or simply Friends, was founded by George Fox in England in the 1640s. Quakerism is a type of Protestant faith that fell outside the government's bounds of acceptable religious belief and practice, and therefore a majority of English men and women rejected their ideas, which led to a lot of physical and published backlash. George Fox questioned the teachings of the established Church of England and other nonconformist groups, and at 19 years old, began traveling from Leicestershire to nearby towns and down to London to talk to ministers of different faiths as a way to work through his own inner religious turmoil. While on his initial journeys, he became enlightened to the main tenet of Quakerism, the inner light. Friends believe this inner light is present in all living beings and acts as a direct divine connection. Once someone becomes convinced of the Quaker message, they recognize the light within themselves and are able to act as a vessel for God's message. One way practicing Quakers fulfilled this portion of their faith was as itinerant ministers. They traveled around England and eventually internationally to preach their faith to any and all that they encountered and tried to convince others to access their own inner light. Today, Quakers are remembered for their pacifism and 19th century abolitionism. So why am I calling them radical? Why did they not fall under the umbrella of acceptable religion? Several aspects of Quaker practice earned them this radical label according to 17th century expectations. Their stance on spiritual equality meant that women were allowed, even encouraged, to preach in public and lead personal religious meetings. This not only challenged accepted religious beliefs, but also accepted gender roles in English society. Both men and women became traveling itinerant ministers because of their inner light and quickly gained Quakerism an aggressive reputation because, first, they constantly preached in public. Second, they interrupted other faith worship services, calling the ministers liars and the practitioners fools for believing these false prophets. They extensively printed religious tracts and engaged in written disputes with leaders of other religious affiliations. And because the Religious Society of Friends refused to recognize the earthly structures of authority and social hierarchy. They initially did not recognize social class distinctions and refused to show deferential respect by removing their hats to people of higher social rank or by using official titles, which of course did not gain them a lot of public support. Itinerancy was not an exclusively Quaker practice. Several other faiths also had traveling ministers, but the Quakers' particular manner of public preaching and conversion was perceived to be much more aggressive. Their constant movement and seeming lack of social productivity caused many townspeople to be wary of traveling friends and to equate them with vagrants worthy of public backlash and condemnation. Preachers were often chased out of town, beaten, or jailed. These journeys covered hundreds of miles each year and very often were conducted on foot. Along the way, because Quakers were not accepted in many locations, they would need to sleep on the side of the roads if nobody in town was sympathetic to their religious views. Why was itinerancy so important to the Quakers if it was this challenging? To Friends, traveling to preach was a spiritual journey. Individuals tested their own faith and godliness, as well as sought to convince others to accept the inner light in Quaker truth. They took the biblical idea of godly walking very literally and entwined itinerancy with their religious identity as a way to demonstrate their interpretation on how to live in a godly manner. They believed traveling to preach was a direct calling from God. Because traveling ministry was so important to the early Quakers, it has been the subject of many historical inquiries. We know many reasons why itinerancy was important to individual practice and expression of faith, as well as how it was interpreted as a radical function of the religious society. But what did it actually look like? And how did different events change the way itinerancy was conducted? This is where visualizing itinerancy becomes important. We can learn a lot more about how itinerancy was the basis of the faith spread rather than just belief. Initially focusing on the early travels recorded by George Fox in particular, we can establish distinctive travel patterns that highlight pivotal moments in the growth of Quakerism. For example, when the travel information from Fox's journal, as pictured here, is turned into a database and coded using the computer language R, we can see how far Fox himself traveled and to where during which years. Between 1643 and 1650, we see that Fox traveled a particular corridor of England while consulting ministers and working through his personal religious turmoil. He used his family home, located here, as his base and continuously returned after different journeys. Each line indicates a particular journey and each circle is a destination. So we can see that 10 times he was up around Nottingham, 9 times he was real close to home in Leicestershire, and all around. Broken down by year, we can see a methodical approach of one area a year. As he started to gain a small following, he was jailed for a year in Derbyshire from 1650 to 1651, where he spent a lot of time writing and publishing about his religious beliefs. As we can see from the second map, Fox's time in jail acted as a turning point in his travels and essentially the faith itself, as he began to travel further north after his release, and he was jailed down here. It was also at this time that Fox tried to return to his family in 1651, but was no longer welcomed. Possibly they were embarrassed by his jail time and publications, and so he was forced to relocate and travel further afield until he found a new base in Swarthmore Hall, up here, in 1652. This marks a turning point in the faith's development and allowed Fox to introduce his ideas in northern England, where he was able to convince many people of Quaker truths and to join him in embracing itinerancy. The itinerant ministry quickly grew, which meant male and female Quakers extended their reach to continental Europe and across the Atlantic within just a few years. These maps are just the beginning of what we can learn from visualizing itinerancy and understanding additional ways it impacted both Quaker individuals and the actual faith itself. Thank you.
So my project, Mobility in Slavery and Freedom, began from an initial interest in using digital tools to think about the concepts of resistance, gender, and space during slavery in the antebellum era of the US, specifically from the years 1830 to 1850. I wanted to visualize the different travels enslaved people took when they ran away from their enslavers, and see if mapping their journeys shows us anything interesting or new about resistance and geography during this time in history. To understand my project, you need to understand the story of Jacob Green, which was found in his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of J.D. Green, a runaway slave from Kentucky. As you'll see, Jacob Green's story reflects my project's arguments and methods in a variety of ways. So this is a map I created of Jacob Green's journey away from slavery, and you'll see a part of slavery still. His journey starts with this larger radius here in Queenstown, Maryland, and ends in the second largest radius over here in Toronto, Canada. And the different types of movement he goes through is represented in different colored lines. So we have a red line is moving while enslaved. A green line signifies moving while escaping, and blue is moving while free. So Jacob Green was first enslaved in Queenstown, Maryland, but in 1813 he ran away and escaped his enslaver into Philadelphia. Unfortunately, a few months in Philadelphia, he was caught and re-enslaved and forced to travel to Memphis, Tennessee with his new enslaver. He did escape again, this time making it all the way to Utica, New York. Unfortunately, in Utica, he ran into his former enslaver, who then forced him to travel across the state of New York and board a steamboat traveling from New York to Ohio. But halfway across Lake Erie, Green jumped out of the boat and swam to Ohio's shores, relocating eventually to Zanesville, Ohio, where again he was jailed and re-enslaved. Green eventually did escape slavery the fourth and final time by capitalizing on traveling one night with his mistress out of town and tying her to a tree and fleeing by horse. Thanks to the help of the Underground Railroad network, Green eventually makes his way to Toronto, Canada in 1848 and is then considered a free man. Green's unique story showed me three different things as a historian using computational tools. First, the path to freedom was not linear, easy, or ever guaranteed. For Green was caught and re-enslaved 3 different times, and as you can see, his story is not one neat line. It's a bunch of zigzags back and forth across the United States. Second, Green's story taught me that mobility was integral in slavery, freedom, and the moments in between. Green traveled when he was enslaved, escaping, and free. He was enslaved when he sailed across Lake Erie, escaping when he jumped out and swam to shore, and later moved as a free man thanks to the Underground Railroad network. Green, like many other enslaved people of the antebellum era, constantly moved between not only different geographical areas, but also different political states of being. His story made me realize I wanted to visualize runaways' journeys by their paths and not their destinations. So for most of my maps, there are different colored lines showing a certain category for each type of movements instead of different colored points or other ways to emphasize the destinations themselves. Thirdly and lastly, Green's story shows the range of strategies and transportation enslaved people took while enslaved, escaping, and free. Green used multiple disguises, took a boat, a carriage, a train, he walked, he rode horses, and he swam all throughout his journey towards freedom. This project maps Jacob Green's story, but also the story of 8 other people, some famous and some anonymous figures who escaped slavery. And all 9 of those movements are shown in this map here. Though Green's case is unique, it provides a good backdrop to all the dimensions of movement that are fragmented pieces in other historical character stories, like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and anonymous people found in runaway newspaper advertisements. I mostly read and created quantitative data from narratives and biographies published in Documenting the American South, North American Slave Narratives, which helped create a spreadsheet of the different types of movement for each person and the different types of transportation they used. I then used a leaflet package in our software to map and compare these 9 different journeys. Though the individual people mapped are not representative of the time period or of all escapees from slavery in the US, Mapping and comparing their different movements shows how mobility was a part of slavery, freedom, and the moments in between, and also suggests potential areas for further study of transportation and the use of disguises in the history of enslaved people running away. Thanks.
Thank you all for your presentations. They were all fantastic. So now as we move into the discussion section of the roundtable, you can all feel free to jump in for our panelists and audience members to engage in a conversation. And to kick us off, I'm going to ask each of you about this theme of data sets that are going through all your presentations. You're either creating a data set from sources that are not typically considered data, or you're reimagining how these data sets that exist can be used. And within that, there's that tension of creating people as statistics. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the creation of these data sets, the reimagination of it, and how that tension plays into your work.
I would say one of the biggest challenges when creating your own data set, which I know Laura, Georgia, and I all did, is deciding what goes into the data set. Because as historians, we're like, oh, this is all so important, but we have to think about, okay, for the map, what am I proving? What am I showing? So it's difficult or challenging really to break down what is absolutely necessary for this distinct purpose. I don't know if they have anything to add to that, but it's a new way of thinking about your material.
Yes, absolutely. For me, it was a lot of the same like kind of process going through it. I started out looking at the registered discharged pupils from the school for those years. And after I was going through it for a while, I realized that there was a lot of discrepancies in the data. So you have to make some decisions as a historian, because you'd have like students' names would be one thing on one school document and something else on another, or that they would have discrepancies in where the student was actually from. And then, like Katie said, you also have to go through and you kind of have to like focus in on what you specifically want to focus on. For me, I wanted to focus on the runaways, but there was also some like really interesting stuff about students that had been expelled for behavior problems, such as lighting the school on fire and stuff like that. So that could have been another potential form of resistance, but I had to narrow it in. And I feel like you also have to kind of combine your digital humanities skills with your traditional historian toolbox. So a lot of the school records I went through had very racist, very ethnocentric descriptions of these runaway students, you know, saying that like this student, you know, is being expelled for, you know, uncurable stupidity and stuff like that. And you have to do that deep reading as a historian and be like, that's the cultural bias. Let's try to bring in the Native American perspective.
Yeah, and on that note, creating your own data set is helpful in ways when you're trying to look at something that you don't think is curated in that exact way you want to look at it. But like Katie and Georgia are saying, the difficulties is in making decisions, and you just kind of have to embrace that there's going to be something you miss or something you're going to have to leave out, and you can kind of make a mental note and maybe move on. In my case, making my own data set actually helped me process and sort of readjust when necessary of how I was thinking about my data and just my subject of study. And I found in creating my own data set, I kept having a variable called location reason. My data set, each row was a destination an enslaved person reached. And so I kept adding in, while making my own data set, the reason that person was at that location. That just ended up being important to me as I was making the data set. And so doing that made me realize, like I said in my introduction of the project, that I actually wanted to value more so the past and the journeys they took more than the actual destination and that arrived location. So in my instance, making my own data set helped me think through my subject of study, but also what I wanted the end goal to look like.
So for me, it was different because I didn't create my own data set. I used IPUMS, who created the data set. And it's funny to hear you guys talk about the choices you have to make. You know, I sometimes complained a little bit as I was going through it, but now I'm, listening to you guys, even though I talked to you guys through this process, I'm really hearing you now that it's not, it's not easy to make these decisions. And it was hard because, IPUMS has tons and tons of categories of race, ethnicity, and birthplace. So for example, they have one on a Hispanic name and whether that makes that person Hispanic. And it's a complicated process. They look at you, they look at your parents, where they were born, what their names were. They then look at your grandparents and so on and so forth. And I really respect their process. But it's still hard. And I still know that people are missed and people are not recognized, especially in New Mexico, because you don't necessarily can go back all the ways to the Spanish census, or maybe they didn't go back. So I know for a fact people are kind of missed. But you do get to the point where it feels uncomfortable because you are studying people. And there's always that realization as I'm making people into numbers. And for me, at some point, that didn't sit right with me. So you're always pushing your scholarship to include, the human side, to make sure that it's not just this data set, that's representing a bunch of people. And especially on a census, you're already building off, a form that has like structural racist issues to begin with. So it's really hard to kind of balance all those and try to make something that's representative of who people were and where they were.
Great. Mike and Sarah, do you want to ask any questions?
Yeah, I have one, if I may. I'm very interested in the way in which all of this plays into the question of the historical creative act, if I can call it that. In other words, in your experience, is the act of, the creativity of coming up with a new way of looking at the histories you're studying, is that something which comes first and then you use the data to exploit that initial thought, or does it come from the data itself? Is there an act of creativity in creating the data or manipulating the data which adds something to our toolkit as historians?
I would argue for a little bit of both. I think it starts with an idea that you want to visualize and you're so excited about it, and then you start putting the data in and either that looks great or you're like, oh, wait a minute, this other thing over here is so much more interesting. Let me follow that path. So it definitely starts with something that you think, a creative idea that you think you have, and then it can develop into something else, which can be even a little bit better. But there's definitely a little bit of both. And every time you try and visualize something, I think you learn a little bit more about the potential or another avenue of which you can research.
Yeah, I definitely echo the both part. I think I come from a place more of letting your sources drive your choice in digital humanities, because you don't want to run into that pitfall of shaping your research to fit into this great digital thing that you want to do so bad. And at some point you just have to let it go and be like, recognize that it's not working. Laura and I are kind of in this situation now where we're working on a new project, and we don't know what our end digital piece is going to look like because we're, in the conducting research phase. But definitely I think, for my dissertation, I'm playing with the idea of doing text analysis on New Mexican newspapers after like 1848. So in that case, I can kind of know, hey, I kind of know what I'm looking for. I really want to see if the military being in the area affected the way people were talking about American Indians in the region, particularly Navajos and the Pueblo Indians. So in that sense, I go in with something and it's a text analysis, but I don't know what the end product will be and where I'll want to go with it. But definitely this project with the census did not turn out the way I planned, because everything I wanted to study, I just couldn't find. So I, had to kind of go where the data was taking me and be okay with that.
I think that's part of the beauty of it too, because you can, like, those of us who made maps can go and saying, oh, I want to make a map. And then you actually geocode everything, you put it in, and oh, I didn't expect it to look like that, but I've discovered something new. So you can go in with an idea of an approach. You never know what's going to come out of it. And that's where, you know, your sources are telling you what's actually happening compared to what we think about when we just read it on paper.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think also computational history and kind of using quantitative data. I'm borrowing this from Dr. Lincoln Mullen, who was our professor for this class. So I'm by no means trying to take credit or words out of his mouth, but he taught us, and by using this data, I have learned that these kind of digital quantitative methods can do sort of two different things. It can illustrate something you think is going on, or some kind of historical trend. Like Janine's project, she might have known that 1900 population decline in Hispanic born people, maybe not, but if she kind of had already had a sense of that and mapped that out in the plot, that really is illustrative of what was going on at the time. And that might have driven her to other questions and other understandings, but that is kind of an example of when you can use data to illustrate something that you already think you kind of know. And then the second way that these tools can help as well is in more of an exploratory analysis of, if you have a corpus or just a body of texts or census records or runaway advertisements, whatever it is, you can kind of do some reasoning of, okay, how many times is South Carolina mentioned over Alabama, or whatever it is. And sometimes using that data, even if it's not a visually aesthetic, nice result at the end, kind of helps you clarify more questions and then kind of continue in the journey of investigating. So I would definitely argue both of those things kind of happen regardless when you're using quantitative data.
Yeah, for me especially, I feel like R in using quantitative data allowed me to see patterns that I would have never been able to figure out on my own. So like with mine, I was able to see by creating line graphs that in the years that there was the most cases of students or dismissed from the school for either dying or being too sick to continue education, those were the years that runaways also were increased. And also like looking at the school in the distance from where the students initially were and to where it was, it's like kind of giving that background and providing insight into the different decisions and the different factors that were contributing to these students' decisions to run away.
And I think ultimately too, right, your end piece has to be something people can understand, you know, because it's, you create this, you wouldn't write a paragraph that's so, well, lots of academics write paragraphs that are so convoluted you can't really get through them. But, you know, in a digital piece, it's the same. In the end, you have to pick the choice that gets your point across the easiest to the most people, because not all people are digitally literate and can understand more complex kind of visualizations. It's not to say that we shouldn't make them, but we do need to know our audience in the end and pick the methods that are most clear to the people you are trying to reach.
I think that's all really interesting. And what's kind of striking about how you're taking these sources is that you're all talking about groups that were not the dominant political force. And that's much harder to find in sources, especially doing traditional readings. So can you talk about how doing it quantitatively changes how groups that aren't necessarily at the forefront or are underrepresented can be found by doing data analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think is really important and has taught me the value of using quantitative data, but it can be methodologically tricky to an extent. I started the project, you know, still wanting to look at the history of enslaved people running away in terms of, so thinking about race and resistance and geography. But I initially looked at more so corpuses of newspapers for runaway slave advertisements, which I still incorporated into this project, but that's also why I kind of ended up using my own data set, because it was a patchwork of from different databases and different sources. But even recovering different journeys of basically an enslaved person that had kind of an oddball name, and I could track okay, this advertisement for them was in South Carolina and this year, and like the next year, it's the same oddball name in this location. Like I could piece things together, which that person, that enslaved person in, 1830 something probably is not found elsewhere in any archive or in any kind of, historical memory by any means. And so that act in and of itself, even if it's, 3 points and 2 lines of like a very short journey that we still have questions about, is still kind of rewriting that person's story to some extent and showing that their resistance and agency in, this oppressive history of slavery. So I think that is definitely worthwhile of the cause. But it was harder and there were more gaps using that specific source. So that's why I did turn to narratives and autobiographies of formerly enslaved people, which that still, using digital tools, helped kind of visualize their journeys in a very different way than sitting down and reading the memoir of Jacob Green. And I think the digital piece, it made it more, to some extent, publicly accessible for someone to glance more quickly at a map made of his journey than sit down and read 100 pages of his journey told by him, which I recommend doing both, but it definitely opens it up to be more accessible for folks.
Yeah, and for me, the source that I initially started looking at was the discharge section of the Register of Pupils. And this source was steeped in a lot of bias and ethnocentric point of view. And I feel like digital skills allowed me to kind of read between the lines and to look for these patterns that were not present in the initial source. And also, like, so when I was doing it, I started mapping it out to see what time of year students are running away the most. And so that's when I would see, like, in December, you have a major drop off of runaways, which probably has something to do with the weather. In Pennsylvania in December, it's freezing. And so when I saw that in 1891, we did have a couple of runaways in December, I was like, well, that's pretty unusual. So I did something as simple as a newspaper search and typed in on newspaper, I think it was like Chronicling America. I went into the newspapers and just typed in like 1891 Carlisle runaway, let's see what I get. And I ended up getting this fantastic story in the Pittsburgh Dispatch talking about how these students had run away and had jumped from a moving train to like escape recapture. And that is something that I would have not even known to look for had I not realized that, it's interesting and it's unusual for these students to be running away in the middle of December. Let me like see if there's any story behind that.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. I had a lot of issues with IPUMS. Like I said, I think they do a really good job at trying their best to represent people of color. But I think in some ways what they have done has actually erased kind of some identities that are important. So, on the 1850 census, the American Indians that are there, at least in Santa Fe, have a birthplace that really tells you kind of where they came from. So a Navajo is a Navajo, a Utah is a Utah. I don't think any Apache showed up. So to group them all as American Indians really does history a disservice, because if you look at the newspapers from that time, Pueblo Indians, according to American Eyes, are kind of this epitome of what American Indians should be: docile, quiet, mind their own business. They're settled. Where the Navajos are, your typical Indians we want to get. They're, raiding us. They're warlike. We're going to go find and pick a battle with them, and we don't really care what they're doing. Our point is just to destroy them. So when you group, people like that into one category, I think it's a big problem. And then also, I think that, on the other side, it is very hard to find names of people, right? Manuel McKnight, I see him on 2 census and that's it, and then he disappears. Now I haven't gone to Santa Fe and done research on on lots of archives in Santa Fe, and perhaps he would pop up. But I think it's important because, as Georgia was saying, even simply doing a Google search, that's how I know Kitty McKnight, the African-American slave in the McKnight family, was freed, because she came up on a digitized court record from Minnesota. You know, so now, like, that people are digitizing archives and things like that, we have more tools at our disposal to kind of find people. Court records are hugely important to kind of find people who are normally missing, or to be able to find more people, but it also kind of closes the door, and we just have to be mindful of both those.
And for my project, it's while the Quakers were on the fringes of accepted society, they're prolific writers, and my subject happened to be a literate white man. So that makes it definitely a lot easier source material-wise, until you get around, and eventually I would like to map much wider travels among people across the Atlantic. But you get down to the Caribbean with natural disasters, and the climate makes it really hard to store materials, and so archives have a lot of challenges down there, or at least they did. So I think that mapping what we have from these incredibly prolific writers, they recorded pretty much everything, all of their travels, really helps to show the dedication of anybody whose travels were lost. In 1654, George Fox traveled almost 1,000 miles. That's a lot to do by yourself, mostly on foot, in 1 year. So, and even across different faiths that were itinerants, we may not have records for them, but just showing the dedication that it takes to adopt this lifestyle and this expression of faith is absolutely incredible. And I think it can help us understand other individuals who may have been lost to the record.
Great. I just want to check, Mike and Sarah, do you have any questions you want to ask right now?
Yeah, I do. So sort of, I think, riffing on that last question where you talked a lot about some of the things that this kind of analysis can show us about people who might have kind of gotten lost. I'm wondering if, on the flip side, there are any ethical issues around doing this kind of analysis. Is there anything that can kind of, possibly cause harm to the people? I mean, I guess probably not harm now because it's taking place in the past, but perhaps things that maybe are a little bit more questionable or around those ethics.
Yeah, if you guys don't mind, I can take that first. I think anytime you're studying somebody outside of your culture, you are going to run into ethical issues because they may not have the same outlooks that you have, right? So especially in dealing with American Indian cultures, you do have to be mindful of how they are viewing what you're putting out there, what records you're looking at, how you're reading them, because you may be reading them in one way and they kind of read the same thing in a different way. So I think kind of ways to approach that is to, have contact with multiple people within the community, not just one, because one person doesn't speak for a community, but to have multiple contacts and see how they feel, hear their stories, see what they think is appropriate. And then maybe sometimes you have to make that hard decision. I think of Claudio Sant, Black White Indian. I'm not sure if any of you have read that, but he delves into a family of, was it Muskogee, I think, Indians who had to make the choice. Do we want to be white? Do we want to be Indian? Or do we want to be Black? Because they owned slaves. And, this woman owned her brother's wife and her nieces and nephews because the mom had been a slave. And people did not want this to come out. One, because they didn't want people to know that they had African American in their blood, or they just didn't want it to come out for the people to know that their family kind of had made this kind of decision at some point. And he went on and published it anyways. And what he did never sits right, but it's also been one of the most powerful books I've ever read as far as my academic, kind of knowledge and evolution. So I think there's always ethical issues, and sometimes you if it doesn't feel right, you just have to say no, or you have to try to find a way that is right for you. And I think the most responsible thing we can do is kind of give some of that agency back to people, because especially in American Indian tribes, they're not looking at their ancestors as something that's dead and someone who's not going to affect who we are, because it's very much their history and involved who they are. So the harm, could be a multitude of different things, but it's such an excellent question and something we always have to keep in mind. And I don't think there's always like easy one answers to that.
Yeah, I agree. The problem for representation, I think for me, was the most, I don't know, like, I guess like the most problematic when it came to actually constructing the map. So I knew I wanted to focus on where initially these students were coming from. And I used cluster markers to see how many students from each specific location are running away. But then I was concerned that these cluster markers are reducing, 50, 60 students to a single spot on a map. So then what I decided to do was, with the cluster markers, create these little pop-up windows. So on my map, if you go and you click the town that had 48 students that were initially there that ran away, you have a marker that comes up for each and every student that ran away, and you're able to click a dot that represents the student, and it gives you their name and their nation and the date they ran away. So I was hoping by doing that you have like, you're not just reducing it to like, here's just a bunch of students that ran away. No, these are actual like human beings. And when you're able to click open that marker and you see tons of dots and each dot represents somebody, you're able to like, I guess, kind of get an idea for like how major the act of running away is.
No, I mean, yeah, that is a wonderful question and something that we as historians, especially studying marginalized people, should always remember. I did struggle with that in my project as well, especially in terms of when I was using runaway newspaper ads. It's, literally reproducing to an extent, an enslaver's words, published words about someone they owned, and kind of, just reproducing their thoughts essentially of where, the enslaved person who ran away was assumed to have traveled to, and mapping that. It's trying to some extent, of course, to give that enslaved person agency and try to think through where they could have ran away to. But it is certainly kind of reproducing that really oppressive archive and just that kind of archival voice. And that is, to an extent, again, thinking about what Georgia was saying about the choices we make in the actual visualizations. That is partially why I decided to focus more on individual journeys and kind of bring it down a level of looking at that individual personalized experience the best that I can. I was initially thinking of, looking at the number of times one city is visited over another, or which cities or areas were more so escaped from than to. But I think in the end, for me, that studying these marginalized people who, are just remnants in archives, if that, I think it's important. And it worked for me, especially the memoirs, to look at these specifics and kind of break it down by individual person.
And I think place is a really interesting concept in and of itself. So when you are kind of creating maps, we're looking at it from a Western sense. So you have to kind of think about, how do these people view their space? How do they view their place? And there's some really interesting digital kind of archives out there now. They're small, but they might have ways that Indigenous people during times of colonization saw a map. They have representation of how they view their place of where they were. So I think that when we're kind of doing this work of Western kind of ways of studying people, we have to think of ways and how best to represent the place according to them. I think I'm just reading Lisa Brooks' Our Beloved Kin, and you know, she's able to really kind of instead of using British colonial names, she uses actually the names of the American Indians of those tribes in those places. And it's a small thing that you can do, but that's also something you can do to kind of represent. So it's just always kind of keeping conscious of that.
And I would say that digital tools can also sometimes directly contradict the narrative that is in the white created primary source. So like in my newspaper article, I had W.P. Campbell, who when reporters are asking him like, hey, are these boarding schools really that great? You know, are they really that effective? And he's like, oh no, it was just one bad Indian. Well, when you're able to map out these runaways and show like in one location that you have 42 students ran away and then 48, and you know, it's increasing and decreasing over the years, that's directly contradicting these school officials that are very much trying to downplay this to try to demonstrate that the schools are successful in assimilation policy.
Yeah, I think what you're all getting at is a very important question. For those listening who have not read it, Algorithms of Oppression is a really great book talking about how computer algorithms and racism can go together. Sarah Gilbert is holding it up on her screen. Great. Because we do have to remember that people are making the algorithms that we do quantitative data with. And it's tricky to learn because historians aren't really in the world of computer science to understand algorithm creation as well as other subject areas. So that is one of the problems we face, and that is something that we have to branch into as historians to at least have a baseline understanding of how are algorithms created, how is this computer science written if we're using this data. So I'm just wondering if any of you want to add any comments about what we need to understand with quantitative humanities to actually continue this work.
It's a really good point, because we're in history because we're not good at math.
Truth.
For most of us, it is not something that comes naturally.
Mhm.
So, you know, and we've had a lot of discussions about, you know, at what point do you just have to trust this data? You know, trust kind of that someone who's much smarter than you at computers and math, like at what point do you just have to trust that what they did kind of was the right thing? But I definitely think by, you know, talking about work with people who are knowledgeable, if you're kind of have the ability to take a class, you know, at a college or university, or attend a workshop to really teach you how best you can look to see if data is something that you can trust, or at least understand enough to have a critical eye of it. And I don't think it really ever stops for us as historians, you know, as kind of new kind of ways of looking at data emerge, we have to kind of learn, right, to understand how that data is behind and works. And I think that finding people you trust is helpful, right? Because we can't do it all. So if you can align yourself with scholars who you know have good work, who have ethical work that you can kind of bounce your ideas off of and help you understand is really, really important, because it's just too multi-layered, I think, for most people to kind of do it all themselves.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of Trudeau's silencing the past. And I feel like as historians, we have to acknowledge that in every single step of the history making process, silences are entering the historical record, from the person who decided to write the journal or the article that you're looking at, and then who decided to archive it, who decided that that was important enough to stick in an archive, then who went into that archive and decided that's important enough to write in this paper, and then who was the historian that went in there and had their own implicit and explicit bias and was going through it and making their own interpretations. I feel like digital humanities is another step of that process where there is the potential to enter more silences in, although your goal is to redeem some of those voices, but you have to acknowledge that you have your own bias. When you're creating, like when I was creating my data set, some of my friends had said, oh, why don't you mention gender? Well, when I'm going through the initial archive, they did not have listed for every student the gender. So I was a little concerned about trying to assign people gender based on like, okay, this name sounds feminine, I'll go with female, you know, kind of thing. You have to acknowledge all these biases and you have to be aware of them.
Yeah, that reminds me of Sharon Block's book, Colonial Complexions, and she actually does computational methods on runaway newspaper advertisements for runaway enslaved people. And that really just kind of was a huge breakthrough for me, just reading it and thinking about what we're talking about with methods and kind of trying to really check our own personal biases as historians and the biases we're injecting in a data set we're looking at, even if we're aware of, you know, the context and the biases during that source in its creation historically. Even thinking about, Block talks about in her book, like mentions of skin color in 18th century sources, like white or black does not necessarily equate to how we think of race in modern day times. And so really, you know, if you're trying to do a text analysis of how many times, you know, white versus black versus mulatto is mentioned in a text, that does not always equate to white African American or American Indian by any means of modern standards. And so that is just something that I think is a really important point that can be applied to gender or really any kind of thing that we're trying to have a historical understanding of. And so I think a good step in approaching and using these sources digitally and computationally, because I think there's still extreme value in it, is I think first definitely contextualizing the source itself and what you are gaining from that source, and then from there kind of applying computational methods and quantifying it from there, because it can get really tricky in all the sort of biases we're talking about.
I think we have to acknowledge, at least I know we all have, this is a huge learning curve. I think not just for us as students, but like in general for humanities. So I think we have to acknowledge this is a huge learning curve, and that it's okay to ask the questions of like, go to somebody you trust, like Jeannie was saying, and saying, hey, does this look ethical? Does this look like, am I approaching it from all the angles that I should? And we just have to remember that these are the digital humanities. Always ask yourself, where are the humans? Where are the people in this story? I'm telling their story. So we're all figuring it out. And hopefully we will get to a place where this is less confusing. But I think that especially when you're dealing with numbers, you're always going to be in a state of wondering, am I doing enough to maintain this within the humanities realm? And it's, yeah, there's so many benefits, but it's always that question of like, you know, am I doing this to really tell their story?
And I also think as a profession, to kind of to turn our heads a little bit on this is, you know, it ends up being about our legitimacy as historians too.
Mm-hmm.
So we need more people who kind of are in our profession who really do understand the nitty gritty of it all. You know, there's tons of conversations about how do you make digital humanities count in, you know, in applications of tenure. You know, if you have a digital historian or a digital humanist who is trying to get tenure and everything's online, but they don't have a book, like how do you count that? So I think Dan's question is a really, really good one. And I think that as historians, you know, we have to keep pushing that line and finding ways to make others see legitimacy. And if legitimacy is by us understanding more, then we need more people who can kind of be jack of all trades, I guess, in the profession.
And on that note, with the praise for my question and the great responses from all of you, I'm getting the warning light from our producer to wrap up. So let me just start by saying thank you to our panelists for these excellent presentations. Thank you for our audience members for helping us hold a great conversation. Thank you to Joe for producing, and thank you to the Ask Historians Conference Committee for setting this up for us, and Ask Historians for providing a great platform for public history.
Thank you, Dan. And
Thanks, Dan.
thank you both to
Thanks.
Sarah and Mike for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.